When you hear the word Hindenburg, what image comes to your mind? Is it the fire? A colossal orange fireball consuming the sky? A skeletal frame collapsing in on itself? Is it the sound? The crackling roar, the muffled shouts, and the horrified, trembling voice of a radio broadcaster? Oh, the humanity! For over 80 years, the Hindenburg has been a symbol. It is a synonym for catastrophic failure. It's a punchline about technological hubris. It is the simple, tragic story of a giant balloon filled with flammable hydrogen that did exactly what everyone feared it would do. That image and that story are seared into our collective memory. But what if that story, the one we all know, the one that's been repeated for generations, is wrong? What if the hydrogen, the obvious culprit, wasn't the instigator? What if the truth is more complex, more scientific, and was hidden in plain sight for almost a century? Before it was a symbol of disaster, the Hindenburg was the symbol of perfection. It was not just an airship. It was a statement. It was a 5-star hotel that drifted silently, serenely, above the clouds. This is the story of how the greatest triumph of engineering in the 1930s became its most infamous tragedy. This is the deconstruction of a myth. Our story begins not in 1937, but decades earlier with one man's obsessive, radical, and often mocked idea. That man was Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a retired German general. The Count was a man possessed by a single vision, the rigid airship. In an era of flimsy, shapeless, wind-tossed balloons, he envisioned a giant, steerable, metal-framed dirigible that could conquer the skies. His first creation, the LZ-1, which flew in 1900, was a clumsy, underpowered beast. It was a technical failure, and the press ridiculed him. His subsequent attempts were plagued by disasters, mechanical failures, and financial ruin. He poured his entire personal fortune into the project. By 1908, it should have been the end. His latest ship, the LZ-4, was destroyed in a storm at Echterdingen. Ripped from its mooring and incinerated, the Count was finished, a ruined man. But then, a miracle. The German people, who had watched his struggles, suddenly saw him not as a failed inventor, but as a national hero, a symbol of German persistence and ingenuity. An impromptu, spontaneous wave of public donations began. School children, farmers, merchants, and aristocrats all contributed. Over 6 million marks were raised. This miracle of Echterdingen saved the Zeppelin Company. It was no longer a private venture. It was, in the hearts of the German people, a national project. The Zeppelin was not just an aircraft. It became a profound symbol of German identity. This popular, passionate support would be the foundation for everything that followed. The airship's terrifying use as bombers in World War I, their post-war resurgence, and their eventual tragic destiny. Before the dawn of the jet age, before the world was crisscrossed by the contrails of passenger planes, Humanity looked to the skies and dreamt of a different, more graceful kind of travel. Not a hurried, cramped dash through the atmosphere, but a gentle, silent conquest, a sovereign drift above the clouds. This was the golden age of the airship. The airship was a physical manifestation of mankind's grandest ambitions, a testament to engineering prowess, a floating cathedral of aluminum and gas. To travel by airship in the 1920s and 30s was the very zenith of luxury. It was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, the famous, and the powerful. While ocean liners like the Titanic sisters ruled the seas, the Zeppelins ruled the air, promising a journey not of speed, but of sublime, panoramic grace. No vessel embodied this success more than the LZ-127, the Graf Zeppelin. Completed in 1928, the Graf Zeppelin was a global sensation. It was the workhorse, the hero, the proof of concept. Commanded by the legendary Hugo Eckener, the Count's brilliant successor, the Graf became the most famous aircraft in the world. In 1929, sponsored by American newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst, and carrying the first woman to circumnavigate the globe by air, journalist Lady Grace Drummond Hay, it completed a sensational round-the-world flight. From Lakehurst to Berlin to a secret refueling stop in Siberia to Tokyo to Los Angeles and back to Lakehurst, the world was gripped by Graf mania. For a decade, the Graf Zeppelin was the model of reliability. It completed 590 flights, flew over 1 million miles, and carried over 13,000 passengers without a single injury or fatality. It established the first ever regular transatlantic passenger service, a route from Germany to Brazil. It was reliable. It was safe. Its success was so profound that it silenced the critics and cemented the airship as the future of intercontinental travel. But Germany, emerging from the ashes of World War I and burning with a new, dark ambition, wanted more. It didn't just want reliability. It wanted a symbol. It wanted supremacy. The Graf Zeppelin was magnificent, but its successor was designed to be perfect. In 1931, construction began on LZ-129. It was designed to be the largest, most luxurious, and most advanced airship ever built. But when it was completed in 1936, the world had changed. The Weimar Republic was dead. Adolf Hitler was in power, and the Hindenburg, named by the company against the wishes of the propaganda ministry for the late President Paul von Hindenburg, was no longer just an airship. It was a tool of propaganda. Dr. Hugo Eckener, a staunch anti-Nazi, found himself in a constant battle with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. Goebbels saw the new ship as a flying billboard for the Third Reich. Eckener saw it as a vessel of international peace. Goebbels, holding the power, almost always won. By law, the Hindenburg's tail fins were emblazoned with the stark, imposing lines of the swastika. Its maiden voyages were not for passengers, but for the state. In March 1936, it flew in tandem with the Graf Zeppelin on a 4-day propaganda flight across Germany, the Deutschlandfahrt, dropping leaflets and blaring patriotic music from massive loudspeakers to encourage a yes vote for Hitler's remilitarization of the Rhineland. Eckener, forced to fly in poor weather, famously cursed the mission. For this, Goebbels declared Eckener a non-person, banning his name and image from all German media. The Hindenburg was a monster of engineering, 804 feet long, a diameter of 135 feet. It was nearly 3 times the length of a Boeing 747 and longer than the U.S. Capitol building. It was and remains the largest flying object in human history. Its power plant was equally impressive. For Daimler-Benz 16-cylinder diesel engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower on demand, but cruising at a quiet 850 horsepower. These engines were a marvel of efficiency, reversible for braking, and giving the ship a range of over 8,000 miles. And as it began its 1937 passenger season, it was the undisputed queen of the skies. It had already completed a successful first year, crossing the Atlantic 17 times, carrying thousands of passengers in perfect safety. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of a new age. It was invincible, or so it seemed. To understand the Hindenburg, you must understand that it was not built like an airplane. It was built like an ocean liner. The passenger accommodations were not an afterthought. They were the entire point. Tucked within the enormous belly of the beast, the passenger quarters were spread across 2 sprawling decks, a deck and B deck, spanning over 7,000 square feet. This was a space of quiet, refined, Art Deco elegance. The heart of the ship was the deck. Here, passengers would find the main dining room, a sprawling space that could seat 50 guests, with silk wallpapered walls depicting scenes from the Graf Zeppelin's global voyages. Meals were multi-course affairs, prepared by chefs in a state-of-the-art, all-electric kitchen. Passengers dined on roasted pheasant, caviar, and fine pastries, sipping German wine from hollow-stem glasses, all as they drifted silently, 2,000 feet above the Atlantic. The silence was the true luxury. With the engines mounted far aft, the passenger quarters were almost perfectly quiet, save for the faint hum of the wind and the soft clinking of silverware. Adjacent to the dining room was the lounge, a masterpiece of minimalist design. It featured comfortable, lightweight aluminum chairs and walls covered in murals depicting the routes of the great explorers. It also featured a grand piano. It was, of course, made of duralumin and covered in pigskin, weighing only 350 pounds. But the most breathtaking feature was the promenade. 2 long, raked hallways, one on each side of a deck, with enormous 15-foot wide windows. These windows were not sealed. They could be opened, allowing passengers to lean out slightly and feel the air, to hear the faint sounds from the world below, to look down on the clouds and the ocean passing by. It was an experience no other form of transport could offer. The passenger cabins were small, but immaculate models of efficient, Bauhaus-inspired design. Each of the 25 cabins had 2 berths, a small sink with hot and cold running water, a fold-down desk, and a call button for the steward. For the 1937 season, 9 new, larger cabins had been added. There was no class system. All passengers were first class. But perhaps the most shocking feature, on a ship filled with millions of cubic feet of flammable hydrogen, was the smoking room. Located on the lower B deck, this was the only place on the airship where an open flame was permitted. It was an engineering marvel of safety. The room was pressurized, so the higher pressure inside would prevent any lighter-than-air hydrogen from leaking in. A single, heavily guarded airlock door was the only way to enter. The room had its own dedicated ventilation system. A steward, stationed at the door, operated the ship's only cigarette lighter. A powerful electric one bolted to the table. Passengers were not allowed to carry their own lighters or matches under any circumstances. This room, this bubble of controlled danger, was a testament to the supreme confidence the designers had in their creation. They believed they had tamed the element that kept them aloft. But this luxury, this 7,000 square foot passenger space, was just a tiny fraction of the ship. The true Hindenburg was a cavern, a colossal, metallic skeleton of 15 massive duralumin rings, some 130 feet in diameter, connected by 36 longitudinal girders, all wrapped in a skin of treated cotton. And inside the skeleton were the gas cells, 16 massive bags made of a complex, layered cotton and holding, in total, 7.062 million cubic feet of lifting gas. These cells were the lungs of the ship, a complex network of catwalks known as keel walkways, ran the length of the ship. Here, unseen by the passengers, the crew lived and worked. Engineers constantly monitored the gas cells, the engines, the tension of the wires. Riggers, the sailors of the sky, walked these narrow aluminum beams, 500 feet in the air, checking for leaks or damage. They were, in effect, living inside a 13-story building, flying at 80 miles per hour. But this magnificent creation carried a deep, inherent, and fatal flaw. The Hindenburg LZ-129 was designed for helium. Helium is an inert gas. It does not burn. It is perfectly, completely safe. The designers at the Zeppelin Company, led by Dr. Eckener, knew this. They designed the Hindenburg specifically to be filled with helium, even giving it 8% less volume than its hydrogen-filled predecessor, the Graf Zeppelin, in anticipation of helium's lesser lift. But there was one insurmountable problem. The only country in the world with a commercially viable supply of helium was the United States. And the United States, under the 1925 Helium Act, had a government monopoly on the gas, which it viewed as a strategic military resource. In the 1930s, the United States was deeply suspicious of the new German regime. The U.S. military, recognizing helium's strategic value for its own airship program, was hesitant to sell it to a nation that was openly rearming, Dr. Eckener traveled to Washington, D.C. He met with President Roosevelt. He pleaded, he argued, he leveraged his global fame. He argued that the Hindenburg was a civilian vessel, a vessel of peace. The president was sympathetic, but the decision ultimately lay with one man, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. Ickes was a staunch anti-Nazi, and he saw no reason to provide a strategic military resource to Hitler's Germany. He blocked the sale. Eckener was forced to return to Germany empty-handed. The Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was furious, seeing Eckener's failure as a personal insult. The regime gave the Zeppelin Company no choice. If their new flagship was to fly, it would have to be redesigned for the only other viable lifting gas: hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. It provides about 8% more lift than helium. But it has one other property. It is not just flammable. It is explosive. The designers, masters of their craft, accepted this risk. They retrofitted the Hindenburg for hydrogen, pouring all their experience into safety measures. They perfected ventilation systems. They banned static-inducing materials. They created the pressurized smoking room. They believed their meticulous engineering could control the inherent danger of the gas that gave their creation life. It was a calculated risk, compromise. It was a decision that would seal the Hindenburg's fate. May 3rd, 1937, the Hindenburg floated at its mooring mast in Frankfurt, Germany, preparing for its first transatlantic flight of the 1937 season. The mood was optimistic. This was the second year of the Hindenburg's North American service, a route that had become almost routine. The 36 passengers boarding that evening were a mix of wealthy tourists, businessmen, and families. They were not daredevils. They were simply travelers, choosing the most luxurious and modern way to cross the ocean. There was the Ernst family returning to America, the industrialist Berger Brink, and the journalist Ferdinand Bellin. There were the adult journalists Gertrude and Leonard, who were guests of the Zeppelin Company. And there was Joseph Spa, a German-American vaudeville performer, an acrobat and comedian who was bringing his German shepherd, Ola, with him in the ship's cargo hold. There was a 16-year-old cabin boy, Werner Franz, excited for the journey, his first trip to America. In command was Captain Max Pruss, a veteran commander, deeply experienced, a true believer in the future of airship travel. Alongside him was Captain Ernst Lehmann, a former commander and a senior figure at the Zeppelin Company, who was on board as an observer. The crew of 61 was a mix of seasoned veterans and young trainees. They were the best in the world at what they did. At 8:15 p.m., the lines were cast off. The colossal ship rose silently into the night sky, its windows blazing with light, a star created by man. It turned west towards the Atlantic. The journey itself was, for its first 72 hours, utterly unremarkable. Passengers settled in. They read in the lounge. They wrote letters on Hindenburg-crested stationery. They gathered for the formal dinners. The aluminum piano was played. Joseph Spa, ever the performer, entertained other passengers with his balancing acts. The ship flew over Cologne, then crossed the coast of the Netherlands. It drifted over the English Channel and headed out into the open ocean. The weather was, for the most part, excellent. The ship encountered some headwinds, but this was normal. Captain Pruss was a master of pressure pattern navigation, using weather systems to his advantage, often flying into a storm's rotation to gain a tailwind. For the 36 passengers and 61 crew, these were hours of sublime, peaceful travel. They were suspended between two worlds, cocooned in their warm, quiet, silver ship. They were utterly oblivious to the fact that they were living the final hours of an entire era. The ship was a marvel of efficiency. The engines hummed, the riggers walked the keels, the stewards served wine. Everything was precisely as it should be. On the morning of May 6th, the Hindenburg arrived over the coast of North America. It passed over Boston, a familiar and welcome sight. From there, it turned south, following the coastline towards its destination, the Naval Air Station at Lakehurst, New Jersey. This is where the Hindenburg's perfect routine began to unravel. As the airship approached Lakehurst in the early afternoon, a line of severe thunderstorms was moving through the area. The weather was foul: rain, high winds, and lightning. Commander Charles Rosendahl, the commander of the Lakehurst Naval Air Station, was a seasoned airshipman himself, and he did not like what he saw. He radioed the Hindenburg. He advised Captain Pruss that a landing was impossible. The conditions were too dangerous. Captain Pruss was forced to delay. He turned the Hindenburg away from the storm, taking his passengers on an impromptu sightseeing tour. He flew south along the New Jersey coast down to Atlantic City and then looped back north. For hours, the Hindenburg waited. The passengers, initially amused by the detour, grew restless. The crew, prepared for a 4 p.m. landing, remained on alert. The ship was already several hours behind schedule. This delay was more than an inconvenience. It was a critical and tragic waste of time. Every minute the Hindenburg waited, the atmosphere grew more unstable. But more importantly, the ship itself was changing. To maintain its altitude, an airship must be in equilibrium. As it flew, the 4 massive diesel engines consumed fuel. For every hour of flight, thousands of pounds of diesel fuel were burned. This made the ship lighter. To compensate for this increasing lightness, the ship had to vent hydrogen. Valves at the top of the gas cells would be opened, releasing precious lifting gas into the atmosphere to prevent the ship from rising uncontrollably. But on this day, there was another problem. The ship had passed through a low-pressure system and was now entering a high-pressure, humid area. The air was heavy with moisture. Rain had soaked the massive cotton skin, adding tons of uncalculated weight to the airship. Captain Pruss was now fighting a ship that was both heavy from the rain and light from the fuel burn. It was a complex, delicate balancing act. He was reported to be agitated, chain-smoking in the control car's non-smoking area. By 6 p.m., the weather seemed to be clearing. Commander Rosendahl radioed that the squall line has passed. He advised the Hindenburg to land as soon as possible, as he feared another storm was approaching. At 7 p.m., the Hindenburg appeared over Lakehurst. It was dusk. The ship was still heavy, sluggish from the rain. Captain Pruss made 6 sharp turns, a standard maneuver to slow the ship, but also one that put immense stress on its 800-foot-long derailment frame. At 7:21 p.m., the Hindenburg began its final approach. It was 12 hours late. The crew was tired. The ship was unbalanced. The air was electric. The stage was set. The landing of a Zeppelin was a precise, almost balletic military operation. It required a ground crew of over 200 men, a mix of naval personnel and civilian volunteers. Captain Pruss was attempting a high landing or flying more. The ship would drop its landing ropes from a high altitude, about 200 feet, and be winched down to the mast. This was faster but more difficult than a static engine-off landing. The ship approached the mast, but it was heavy. The tail seemed sluggish. Captain Pruss, fighting the controls, ordered a full astern on the rear engines to stop the ship's forward momentum. He also ordered the release of 1,100 pounds of water ballast from the tail to try and level the ship. It was still tail-heavy. In a final attempt to trim the ship, Pruss ordered a final gas venting maneuver from the rear cells. This was a critical decision, releasing flammable hydrogen into a humid, electrically charged atmosphere. On the ground, the crew watched. The light was fading. A light rain was falling. The air was thick with humidity and static electricity. The ship, having flown for hours through electrically charged storm clouds, was now dangerously charged. Its metal framework had built up a massive electrical potential. The landing ropes, made of heavy, wet manila, were dropped from the bow. As soon as these ropes hit the wet ground, they earthed the ship. They provided a path for the colossal static charge on the Hindenburg's frame to discharge into the ground. Eyewitnesses, both on the ground and in the ship, reported seeing a faint, blue glow on the ship's skin, a phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. It was a sign of a massive electrical differential between the ship and the air. The ship was a floating capacitor waiting for a spark. 7:25 p.m. The first flame appeared. It was not an explosion. It was a bloom, a small, silent blossom of fire, high on the port side of the tail fin. Eyewitness R.H. Ward, on the ground, saw it begin. It was on the top, aft of the port engine. It just popped. On board, helmsman Helmut Lau, stationed in the lower tail fin, heard it. A muffled detonation, he later called it. like the sound of a gas burner lighting. This first small fire was likely hydrogen, but what ignited it? Two theories emerged almost immediately. The first, static discharge. As the frame of the ship was earthed by the landing ropes, a massive potential difference was created between the metal frame and the fabric skin, which was separated by non-conductive insulators. A spark leaped across this gap. The second theory, mechanical failure. Those sharp, high-stress turns Captain Pruss had made minutes earlier could have caused a bracing wire inside the structure to snap. This wire whipping around could have slashed open a gas cell. This would have caused hydrogen to leak inside the ship, mixing with the oxygen in the air. All it needed was a spark. That spark ignited the leaking hydrogen. This initial fire, small and contained, then found its real fuel. On the ground, a radio journalist from WLS in Chicago, Herbert Morrison, was recording what he expected to be a routine, slightly boring arrival. His words and the raw, unfiltered horror in his voice would become the most famous and most tragic broadcast in history. Here it comes, ladies and gentlemen. It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and it's burst into flames. The fire erupted on the tail, and Morrison's professional tone shattered. Get out of the way. Get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, the humanity, all the passengers. The Hindenburg did not explode. It burned. After that first muffled pop, the fire spread with terrifying speed. But it did not spread up. It spread across the skin. The fire consumed the tail, and the ship, now impossibly tail-heavy, tilted backwards. A massive plume of hydrogen, ignited by the fire, erupted from the back of the ship in a colossal fireball. Then the integrity of the ship failed. The aluminum rings, softened by the intense heat, collapsed. The ship broke in two. The bow tilted upwards to the sky, a final, desperate salute, as the rest of the ship crashed to the ground. From the first spark to the moment the hull hit the ground, it took just 34 seconds. In just over half a minute, the largest flying object ever made was reduced to a smoking skeletal ruin. The horror of the image was seared into the public consciousness. It looked unsurvivable. A 600-foot-tall inferno. And yet, the miracle of the Hindenburg is not how many died. It is how many lived. Of the 97 people on board, 36 passengers and 61 crew, a staggering 62 survived. How? The fire, for all its speed, burned upwards. The hydrogen, being lighter than air, rose, taking the worst of the flames with it. The passenger decks, located deep in the belly of the ship, were one of the last things to be consumed. When the ship crashed to the earth, the impact was softened by the collapsing framework. It was a fall of only 100 or 200 feet. Survivors were not burned alive in the air. They were thrown from the ship or jumped as it neared the ground. Passengers on the promenade deck, seeing the ground rushing up, leaped from the open windows. Joseph Spa, the acrobat, used his skills. He leaped from a window, shielded by his camera, and fractured his ankle upon landing. The 16-year-old cabin boy, Werner Franz, was inside, in the officers' mess. When the ship lurched, a water ballast tank above him burst, drenching him and saving him from the initial flash fire. He punched through the fabric skin and jumped, just as the ship hit the ground. He ran and didn't look back, but 35 people on board were not so lucky. Many were trapped in the wreckage. Others, like Captain Ernst Lehmann, who had survived the initial crash, were severely burned. He died the next day, reportedly saying the ship was all my fault. One member of the civilian ground crew, Alan Hageman, was also killed. In total, 36 lives were lost. The world was in shock. The indestructible symbol of the New Age was gone. And the first and most urgent question was, why? The Hindenburg was not just an airship. It was the flying banner of the Third Reich. And in 1937, the world was a tinderbox. Germany was rearming, its intentions growing more menacing by the day. Anti-Nazi sentiment was rampant, especially in the United States. The Hindenburg, with its stark swastikas, was a symbol of an ideology many despised and feared. It was inevitable, then, that the first suspicion to take root was not accident, but attack. The fire, so sudden, so catastrophic, it felt intentional. It felt like an act of war or terrorism. The day after the disaster, the press was filled with speculation. Had a bomb been planted? Was it a communist plot? An anti-Nazi assassin? The idea of a simple, tragic accident seemed insufficient, too small for a disaster of this magnitude. The German government, led by propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, was terrified of this possibility. A public finding of sabotage would be a global humiliation, a sign that the Reich was vulnerable. In Germany, Goebbels immediately seized all footage of the crash, controlling the narrative. The investigation that followed was split in two. The American Department of Commerce, led by Colonel South Trimble, launched its own inquiry. And the Germans sent their own commission, led by Dr. Hugo Eckener himself. Both were under immense political pressure to find an answer. One of the most powerful proponents of the sabotage theory was Commander Charles Rosendahl, the commander of the Lakehurst Naval Air Station. He was the man who had warned the Hindenburg to wait. He was an experienced airshipman himself, and he had witnessed the disaster from the control tower. Rosendahl simply could not believe it was an accident. He, more than anyone, knew the meticulous safety protocols of the Zeppelin Company. He knew how paranoid they were about static electricity. He had watched the Graf Zeppelin land safely dozens of times. To him, The idea that the veteran crew of the Hindenburg, led by Captain Pruss and Dr. Eckener's protege, Captain Lehman, would make such a simple, fatal error was unthinkable. At the American inquiry, Rosendahl testified under oath. He stated, "I feel that the ship was sabotaged. The Hindenburg had made many landings under all kinds of weather conditions. I can't imagine that any static condition would have existed that would have not been taken care of." His conviction was absolute. He believed a bomb had been placed on board, designed to go off after the ship had landed and the passengers had disembarked, to destroy the symbol without killing the people. But the 12-hour delay, he argued, meant the timer-based bomb detonated while the ship was still in the air. His testimony electrified the hearings. The investigators, including agents from the FBI, began to hunt for a culprit. And their suspicions soon fell on one man, the passenger Joseph Spa. Spa was an interesting character. He was a German-American acrobat. He was traveling alone. He was openly anti-Nazi, and witnesses claimed he had been behaving oddly. He had made anti-Nazi jokes. He seemed nervous, and most damningly, he had brought his dog Ola with him. During the landing delay, he had reportedly gone to the freight room to check on his dog, alone. Could Spa, the acrobat, have used his agility to plant a bomb in a restricted area? The FBI investigated Spa thoroughly. They interrogated him in the hospital as he recovered from his broken ankle. They found his story to be consistent and ultimately credible. But the theory gained so much traction that it was even pushed by Dr. Hugo Eckener himself. Eckener, a staunch anti-Nazi, found it politically convenient to blame the disaster on an infernal machine rather than a flaw in his company's design or the dangerous choice of hydrogen. A choice forced on him by the Nazi government. Blaming a saboteur was a way to attack the regime he hated. Another theory, which gained popularity decades later, centered on a crew member, Eric Spell. A historian named A.A. Helling proposed a complex theory that Spell, an anti-Nazi, planted a small bomb using a Luger pistol mechanism as a timer. The sabotage theory was everywhere. It was dramatic. It was political. It offered a villain. But for all its drama, the sabotage theory had one significant problem. There was no evidence. Not one single piece. The FBI cleared Joseph Spa completely. His odd behavior was simply that of an anxious traveler. His visit to his dog was confirmed by a steward. The theory about crewman Eric Spell? It was based on pure conjecture decades after the fact. Spell died in the fire and could not defend himself. The muffled detonation that helmsman Lau heard, it was entirely consistent with the sound of a hydrogen gas cell igniting. The German Investigation Commission, led by Eckener and the American Commission, both sifted meticulously through every twisted girder. They found no trace of a bomb, no shrapnel, No timing device, no battery, no residue. Their official reports, both of them, ultimately concluded the same thing. The Hindenburg was destroyed by an accident. The cause was the ignition of a mixture of free hydrogen and air. The source of that ignition, they concluded, was most likely a static discharge. Commander Rosendahl, despite the findings, would go to his grave believing it was sabotage. Dr. Hugo Eckener, for political reasons, would continue to hint at it. The sabotage theory was compelling. It was a good story. It provided a scapegoat for a regime that could not accept failure and a dramatic explanation for a world that could not understand such a high-profile technological failure. The sabotage theory provided a convenient answer, but it wasn't the real one. We are about to deconstruct the myth that has defined this disaster for 80 years. If you appreciate deep dives that challenge what we think we know, please consider subscribing to the Somnolent Shelf. Your support allows us to build these complex narratives. But the truth, as is so often the case, was not to be found in a conspiracy. It was to be found in the physics. It was written in the very chemical makeup of the ship itself. The investigators in 1937 were close. They correctly identified hydrogen and static electricity. But they missed one crucial element. The ship wasn't just filled with fuel, it was painted with it. For 80 years, the story of the Hindenburg has been a simple one. A giant balloon filled with flammable hydrogen. A spark. A boom. This is what we were told. This is what everyone believed. Hydrogen is dangerous. The Hindenburg was full of hydrogen. Therefore, the hydrogen destroyed the Hindenburg. It's a simple, logical, and incomplete story. The hydrogen did burn. The 7 million cubic feet of lifting gas obviously fueled the inferno and, in the end, sealed the ship's fate. But the evidence, the visual, recorded, undeniable evidence of the film, tells a different story. It suggests that hydrogen was not the instigator. It was the accomplice. The hydrogen theory has always been plagued by nagging, inconvenient questions. Questions that were ignored in 1937, buried under the weight of the sabotage debate and the sheer horror of the event. The first problem? The color. Hydrogen, when it burns in open air, produces a flame that is almost invisible. It's a pale blue with very little luminosity. You can see the heat distortion, but you can barely see the fire itself. The Hindenburg did not burn with a pale, blue flame. Herbert Morrison's broadcast described it vividly. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. It's burst into flaming smoke. The flames are 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific red crash. The newsreel footage confirms it. The fire is a bright, brilliant yellow-orange. It is not a hydrogen fire. It's a fire of something else, something solid. The same kind of color you would see from a massive wood, gasoline, or fabric fire. This bright orange color was the first clue. Investigators in 1937 noted it but dismissed it, assuming it was the diesel fuel from the engines, or the fabric of the gas cells, or the furniture in the passenger decks. But the fire started at the tail, far from the main diesel tanks, and it burned with this brilliant orange before it ever reached the passenger decks. The fire that day was dirty, produced thick, black smoke. Pure hydrogen burns clean, produces only one thing, H2O, water. The Hindenburg belched thick, oily, black smoke. That smoke was not from hydrogen. It was from a material, a solid fuel that was being consumed en masse. The second and more significant problem is the speed and direction of the fire. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. It is 14 times lighter than air. When it burns up violently. If a gas cell had been ignited by a spark inside the ship, it would have exploded upwards, tearing a hole in the top of the ship. The subsequent fire would have shot skyward, like a colossal Roman candle. This is not what happened. The eyewitness accounts and the film show the fire starting on the skin at the top of the tail. It then spread along the entire length of the ship's skin with impossible speed. Within 4 seconds, the entire 800-foot length of the ship was engulfed in flames before the internal gas cells had even had time to ignite. The ship was on fire from bow to stern while it was still structurally intact. The hydrogen burned in massive, rising plumes after the skin was already ablaze. The skin acted like a fuse, a giant 800-foot-long fuse that carried the fire to all 16 gas cells simultaneously. The Hindenburg didn't burn from the inside out. It burned from the outside in. So, if it wasn't the hydrogen, what was it? What was this flammable, solid, fast-burning material that covered the entire airship, burned with a bright orange flame, and produced thick black smoke? The answer had been hiding in plain sight for 60 years. It was the ship's skin. The mystery of the Hindenburg might have remained locked in those old newsreels forever, if not for a man named Addison Bain. Bain was not a historian. He was a retired NASA engineer. In the 1990s, he was working on hydrogen fuel systems for the space program. He, like everyone, had heard the Hindenburg story used as the ultimate warning against using hydrogen. But Bain was a scientist. He looked at the old footage and the story didn't add up. The color was wrong. The speed was wrong. The direction was wrong. As a hydrogen engineer, Bain said, "I knew the hydrogen fire wasn't the cause." His motive was clear. If hydrogen was ever to be taken seriously as a clean fuel for the future, the ghost of the Hindenburg had to be confronted. He needed to prove that the hydrogen wasn't the problem. He began an investigation not as a historian, but as a forensic engineer. He obtained one of the few surviving pieces of the Hindenburg's actual skin, preserved from the 1937 investigation. And he took it to his lab. He analyzed its chemical composition, and what he found was shocking. The skin of the Hindenburg, all 400,000 square feet of it, was a cotton canvas. But to make it airtight, weatherproof, and, crucially, reflective, it was treated with multiple layers of a substance called dope. This was standard procedure for airships. But Bain's analysis revealed what was in that dope. The first layers on the inside were cellulose acetate butyrate, a form of plastic. The final, outer layers, the ones that gave the Hindenburg its iconic silver sheen, were cellulose nitrate, also known as gun cotton, mixed with aluminum powder. Cellulose nitrate is a component of smokeless gunpowder. It is incredibly flammable. Aluminum powder is a primary component in solid rocket fuel. And as if that weren't enough, the dope also contained iron oxide, which is quite literally rust. The German engineers, in an attempt to reflect sunlight and protect the gas cells from radiation, had inadvertently painted the entire 800-foot airship with a substance that was, chemically speaking, rocket fuel. Bain realized the chemical composition was terrifying. The combination of iron oxide and aluminum powder is the exact recipe for thermite. Thermite is not just flammable. It is an incendiary. It is used for welding railroad tracks and in military grenades. It burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Bain conducted a simple experiment. He took a sample of the Hindenburg skin. He applied a simple static spark to it, the same kind of spark that would have been present on that stormy night in Lakehurst. The fabric didn't just burn, detonated. The theory was complete. It answered every question. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg, charged with massive static electricity, approached its mast. The wet landing ropes earthed the metal frame. A massive spark leaped from the frame to the skin. This spark ignited the incendiary paint. The thermite reaction, propelled by the highly flammable cellulose nitrate, raced across the skin at 60 miles per hour, faster than any human could run. This is why the ship was engulfed in seconds. The fire burned with a bright, dirty orange flame, exactly as seen in the film. This massive, 4,000-degree fire then burned inward, torching the cotton gas cells, which then released their hydrogen, adding to the inferno. The Hindenburg disaster was not a hydrogen accident. It was a fabric accident. The hydrogen, which everyone had blamed for 80 years, was only the second fuel to ignite. The fatal flaw was not the gas inside. It was the skin outside. The Hindenburg burned for hours, but the age of the passenger airship died in 34 seconds. The disaster was not just a tragedy. It was a public relations cataclysm. It wasn't that the Hindenburg crashed. Ships and planes had crashed before. It was that it had been seen. The iconic footage and Herbert Morrison's horrified voice played in movie theaters around the world. The public, who had once seen the Zeppelin as a graceful symbol of the future, now saw it as a flying inferno. The image was unsurvivable. The myth was created on the spot. Hydrogen airships were flying bombs. The Graf Zeppelin, the hero of the 1920s, was immediately grounded. It was retired, and 2 years later, it was broken up for scrap metal to build fighter planes for the Nazi war machine. The Hindenburg sister ship, the Graf Zeppelin II LZ-130, was completed in 1938. It never carried a single paying passenger. It was used briefly by the Luftwaffe for electronic spying missions over Britain, and then in 1940 it too was scrapped on the orders of Hermann Göring. The dream of the Counts von Zeppelin, the dream of the floating palace, was over. The future of transatlantic travel would belong not to the silent, graceful giant, but to the airplane. Today, we know the truth. We know that the Hindenburg was a victim of its own skin, a fatal design flaw born from a political compromise. We know that hydrogen, while flammable, was not the culprit. It was the scapegoat, and yet the myth endures. Why? Because the truth is complex. The truth involves static electricity, cellulose nitrate, aluminum powder, iron oxide, and atmospheric potential. The myth is simple. Hydrogen burns. The Hindenburg disaster remains frozen in our collective memory. A 34-second loop of fire and horror. It serves as the ultimate symbol of technological hubris, a reminder that when we build our dreams too high, when we fly too close to the sun, the fall is catastrophic. Even today, as the world searches for clean energy, the ghost of the Hindenburg haunts the word hydrogen. It is the image that comes to mind, the simple, powerful, and incorrect story that has defined our perception of an element. The Hindenburg was not, in the end, destroyed by a bomb. It was not, in the end, destroyed by its hydrogen. It was destroyed by a simple spark and a misplaced faith in its own invincibility. The story of the Hindenburg is a powerful one, and its legacy, as we've seen, is complicated. What part of this story stays with you the most? Was it the political pressure that forced the use of hydrogen, the miracle of the survivors, or the scientific truth that was hidden for so long? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's the conversation and community that brings this history to life.